Welcome back to episode 40 of More Than Words, the show that's now definitively established that a place name isn't just geography, it's a promise. And 2 Mile Bottom delivers on that promise in ways the Forestry England signage has chosen not to acknowledge. This week, a forest that looks like it's been there since the Druids, but was actually planted by unemployed miners from the north of England in the 1920s. A village that held both the lowest June temperature and the highest July temperature recorded in the United Kingdom. And a rear gunner who fell 3.5 miles from a burning Lancaster without a parachute and walked away with a sprained leg. Expect eels used as currency to pay for a cathedral, a hamlet named after a pub, the largest American fighter base in Europe sharing a postcode with a co-op, and Thor nuclear missiles that ended up in a Cambridgeshire field because the church commissioners declined to diversify into weapons of mass destruction. Think Sigmund Freud's grandson living above a pub in the Fens meets a 4,000-year-old flint industry defeated not by war or economics, but by the world simply deciding it no longer needed small rocks to make things explode. Narrated by someone who shot 77, finished third in a field of 153, hit a new handicap low of 6.6, and is now quietly computing that at current rates he'll achieve mastery of golf somewhere around 2038. This is episode 40. There will be mud. Starting with the numbers then, the total distance covered so far is 2,220 kilometres, 77.19% of the revised 2,876 kilometre route and nudging towards the 80% mark. The 3/4 feeling of stage 39 has bedded in. The gold gradient effect, allegedly, should be pulling hard now. The spreadsheet for once appears to agree. The time taken in real life to rack up the miles for this stage was from the 29th of March to the 4th of April 2026, and my current position is 4 days ahead of schedule, back up to the high watermark last seen at the end of stage 36. The buffer has fully rebuilt itself just in time for the lowest point in Britain to finally arrive on the horizon. Home Fen is next, 4 metres below sea level. 40 stages in the making. The bottom of the country has been waiting long enough. IRL, par excellence. The fitness diary this week reads like the log of a man determined to prove he's using retirement productively, whilst also making it abundantly clear what his actual priorities are. There were a couple of windy local walks, the sort where you lean forward slightly and hope the wind either helps or at least doesn't actively try to return you to your front door. A solitary spin session before the usual Wednesday stretch class, and, in a rare and frankly suspicious turn of events, 3 rounds of golf. This has been the stated aim since retirement, 3 games a week. A simple, elegant plan. In reality, this ambition is normally laughed out of the room by the northwest weather, which operates on a rotating schedule of rain, sleet, more rain, and something that isn't technically rain but still leaves you wetter than rain would. Realistically, 2 rounds a week is the annual average, and that's considered a triumph of scheduling over meteorology. But not this week. This week, the meteorological gods briefly lost interest, and I managed a full Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday treble, nicely aligned with the start of the new season, which, in golfing terms, means we graduate from the winter format of 14 holes, designed to give the course a chance to recover from 6 months of being used as a municipal mudslide, back to the full 18. This is excellent news for the stats. A full round racks up somewhere in the region of 11 kilometres compared to 8 to 9 kilometres in winter, which means the step count looks healthier and the spreadsheet more impressive. It is, however, less good news for the legs, and significantly less good news for the psyche when you realise you now have 4 additional holes in which to unravel completely. 3 rounds this week then. A couple of solid workmanlike efforts, the kind where you're not exactly pulling up trees, but you're at least not actively setting fire to them either. And a gradual reintroduction to conditions that no longer involve frost, numb fingers, or the existential dread of plugging your ball in a fairway that could be mistaken for a Fens field where the pumps have stopped functioning. And then Saturday happened. 153 players entered Saturday's competition, which in golf terms means 153 people spending 4 hours oscillating wildly between malcompetence and absolute bafflement, where one shot looks like it's been struck by Rory McIlroy in full flow, and the very next resembles something produced by Rory the racing car after a heavy night. From this shared purgatory I emerged in 3rd place with a round of 77, which, by any reasonable measure, is a result. It also nudged my handicap down to a new personal low of 6.6. Now, I'm not entirely convinced by this number. A handicap of 6.6 implies a level of competence I do not recall possessing. It's like being handed a Michelin star for successfully boiling pasta once. It suggests someone with a repeatable swing, a plan, a sense of control. Whereas I still regularly find myself standing over the ball thinking, right, and how are we doing this today then? However, according to the World Handicap System, a handicap of 6.6 places me in the top 10 to 15% of golfers worldwide, which is clearly excellent news and not at all undermined by the fact that I can still, with no warning whatsoever, produce a shot that travels 30 yards, sideways and mainly along the ground. Although to be fair, my playing partner actually managed to hit a shot that went backwards a couple of feet this week. At that point, the laws of physics quietly excused themselves. All this does, though, point to something real in terms of improvement, or what I like to call the practice makes slightly less terrible theory. I first noticed it when I moved to a 4-day compressed working week. Suddenly there was time for a second round most weeks, and the handicap began to drift downwards. Nothing dramatic, just a slow, steady sanding of the rough edges. Since retiring 9 months ago, and increasing that to 2 to 3 rounds per week, I've dropped another 4 shots. This is, it turns out, entirely consistent with the research. Malcolm Gladwell popularised the idea that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice produces mastery in his 2008 book, Outliers, drawing on the work of psychologist Anders Ericsson, though Ericsson himself was always careful to note that it was deliberate practice that mattered, not just repetition. Simply doing something badly for a long time mostly produces someone who has done something badly for a long time with considerable confidence. Golf courses are full of these people, and they are, to a man and woman, entirely certain that their swing is fine and the course, clubs, weather, delete as applicable, is the problem. Frequency, though, matters independently. Research on motor learning consistently shows that spaced, repeated exposure to a physical skill is more effective than massed practice at consolidating the movement patterns into long-term memory. You play more often, your brain stops treating the golf swing as an emergency and starts filing it under things we have done before, which is, in neurological terms, the difference between a stroke that requires conscious construction from first principles and one that simply happens because your body has done it enough times to make it default. By my rough calculation, I've played somewhere in the region of 2,500 hours of golf over the last 5 years. At the current rate of improvement, I should reach the 10,000 hour threshold sometime around 2038, at which point I should either be a scratch golfer or significantly more philosophical about the whole thing. Possibly both. For now, 3rd place, 77, handicap 6.6, 3 rounds in decent weather for the first time since October. And if recent experience is anything to go by, the biggest remaining variable isn't distance or weather or even golfing form. It's whether I can make it through a full week without injuring myself while asleep, aggravating something while testing new equipment, or attempting a shot that physics itself quietly refuses to support. Still, stage 40, done. Home Fen, added, total distance down by 8 kilometres. I don't make the rules, I just pretend to understand them. We continue. Virtual Insanity Stage 40. 2 mile bottom to Meeple. Stage 40 begins with the distinct feeling that the landscape has decided to throw everything it has at you just to see what sticks. What should be a straightforward stretch of countryside immediately starts behaving like a show reel. Odd names, stranger histories, and the sort of local lore that makes you wonder whether the region's been quietly stockpiling eccentricity for decades. You set off expecting mild countryside and instead get a rolling anthology of British weirdness. A place that sounds like a euphemism, followed by a forest that looks ancient but isn't, then a village that treats temperature records like a competitive sport. It's a route that keeps shifting tone, as if the scenery is flicking through genres out of boredom. And the deeper you go, the more the place seems determined to outdo itself. Quiet settlements reveal industrial backstories that belong in a museum with a health warning. A seemingly ordinary patch of land turns out to be sharing airspace with a superpower. The ground itself keeps threatening to sink, rise, or blow sideways depending on which century you're reading about. and by the time you reach the final stretch, you've accumulated enough improbable anecdotes to make you wonder whether the region is trolling you deliberately. A landscape leaning over your shoulder, whispering, "Go on then, try and summarise this." The bottom line. We take on that challenge by restarting in what is essentially a not suitable for work Google search. 2 Mile Bottom is one of those Norfolk place names that sounds like it should come with law. A lost village, a tragic ballad, perhaps Hobbiton as a twin town. But instead turns out to be brutally literal. It is, quite simply, the bottom, Old English for valley floor, located 2 miles from Thetford. That's the whole story. No spectral nun, no medieval intrigue, no scandalous baron. Just a landscape labelled with the blunt efficiency of someone who'd run out of imagination, daylight, or both. And yet, type 2 Mile Bottom into a search engine and the internet cheerfully offers you a very different flavour of local activity. Various online sources insist the area doubles as a well-established dogging spot. A detail mysteriously absent from the wildlife signage, heritage websites, and Forestry England's soothing talk of butterflies and tranquility. It's a very British land use clash. Conservationists erect interpretive panels about rare heathland birds, and the public responds by turning the car park into a late night social experiment. And yes, I googled it, how else would I know? But I did not, under any circumstances, click beyond the results page. Some hyperlinks are a line you simply do not cross. That way, madness lies, along with a browser history you'd have to explain to a priest. The name naturally prompts the question, if there's a 2 Mile Bottom, where are the others? Locally, disappointingly, nowhere. Norfolk apparently reached 2 and decided that was quite enough numerical ambition for one county. Cambridgeshire, however, gamely chucks in 6 Mile Bottom, a valley 6 miles from Newmarket, named with the same blunt literalism but at least demonstrating a level of follow-through Norfolk simply refused to entertain. The surroundings themselves are classic Breckland. Sandy, open, scrubby, with Thetford Forest looming to the west like a pine barricade, and the A11 humming nearby to remind you that modernity is always just off stage, revving impatiently. It's a landscape that looks peaceful until you remember what the search results say people get up to in the car park. Sir David Attenborough would not narrate this bit. Would you believe it? And so we enter Thetford Forest. One of those landscapes that looks ancient, primeval and quietly self-assured. The sort of place you assume has been here since the Druids were forming committees to decide which direction felt most mystical. In reality, it's barely a century old. A giant man-made pine experiment, born because Britain went into the First World War with plenty of timber and came out of it with almost none. Half the country's productive trees were felled between 1914 and 1916. Which is the kind of statistic that makes you wonder whether anyone in Whitehall had ever actually looked at a forest before signing off the paperwork. It has big we'll sort it out later energy, except later turned out to involve replanting half of Norfolk. Most of that wood went underground as pit props. Long, straight poles used to stop coal mines collapsing, because coal powered everything, and everything needed propping up. Britain had been importing most of its pit props from Scandinavia. Wartime shipping disruption revealed, with embarrassing clarity, that the nation had no backup plan beyond hope the trees grow faster. The Forestry Act of 1919 created the Forestry Commission with a simple brief: never again run out of wood. Breckland was chosen because the land was cheap, the soil was terrible, and the estate owners were financially exhausted enough to sell. The first purchases were made in 1922, and within 20 years more than 80% of the modern forest had been planted, largely by hand by workers earning 6 old pence per 100 trees, planting up to 1,500 saplings a day in winter on open windswept heath. From the late 1920s, unemployed miners from the north of England were shipped into forestry camps across the Brecks. 21 camps in total, housing around 6,000 men. Redirected from extracting coal to planting pines in a landscape that must have felt like the set of a very low-budget western. Today, Thetford Forest is the largest lowland pine forest in Great Britain, covering over 19,000 hectares of Norfolk and Suffolk. It receives more than 1 million visitors a year, hosts national mountain biking championships, stages open-air concerts at High Lodge featuring everyone from Ed Sheeran to Jules Holland, and provides winter racing grounds for the British Siberian Husky Racing Association. Because nothing says East Anglia like a pack of huskies tearing through a conifer plantation while a man in a high-vis jacket pretends this is all perfectly normal. It's also home to red deer, roe, muntjac, nightjars, woodlarks and crossbills, species whose continued existence here depends entirely on a committee of civil servants in 1919 who were worried about pit props. And, in one of those cultural footnotes that feels like a punchline, the forest doubled as Warmington-on-Sea for the exterior scenes of Dad's army, because Thetford has that uncanny ability to look like the 1940s even when it's trying very hard not to. Ice, ice, maybe. Santon Downham is one of those villages that looks like it should be the setting for a gentle Sunday night drama about a vet who solves crimes, but instead turns out to be the administrative HQ of Forestry England's East of England operations, a role wildly disproportionate to a population that could fit inside a medium-sized pub snug. It sits on the south bank of the Little Ouse, surrounded on almost every side by Thetford Forest, like a child who's wandered into a conifer plantation and can't find her way out again. It is also, by its own quiet admission, the United Kingdom's meteorological chaos engine. Santon Downham holds the lowest June temperature ever recorded in Britain, -5.6 degrees centigrade, logged on both the 1st and the 3rd of June 1962, a record it shares with Dalwhinnie, which at least has the decency to be in the Highlands. Suddenly, the husky racing makes perfect sense. And because the village refuses to be typecast, it also has a recorded high of 39 degrees centigrade in July 2022. A place that can swing from Arctic research station to oven ready in summer is either meteorologically gifted or in possession of a weather station with a flair for drama. The data suggests the former. The Breckland Frost Hollow helps, of course. Dips in the land that collect cold air with the same enthusiasm the region's sand once collected in places it absolutely wasn't meant to be. Which brings us to 1668, when Santon Downham experienced what can only be described as a Saharan crossover episode. A sandstorm blew in from the Lakenheath Warrens to the south, overwhelming upwards of 1,500 acres, choking the Little Ouse, and burying parts of the village under dunes like a Suffolk remake of Lawrence of Arabia. Contemporary accounts describe houses half submerged, fields swallowed, and a farmhouse accessible only by climbing over two 8-foot walls because the sand had blocked every other route. It took years to recover, and decades for the landscape to stop looking like a desert that had taken a wrong turn at Cambridge. And if Santon Downham's history of frostbite, heatstroke, and 17th century sand-based annihilation weren't enough, the local news continues to do its bit to keep the village's reputation for drama alive. Recently, the big headline, and I mean the headline, was that St Helens picnic site is getting a new name. A story reported with the breathless energy normally reserved for royal births or escaped zoo animals. Only in the Brecks could a rebranded picnic area make the front page, complete with quotes, community reaction, and the sort of civic gravitas usually associated with infrastructure projects. It's a reminder that in a place where the weather can kill your crops, bury your house, or melt your thermometers, the only sensible response is to treat a renamed car park like a national event. Santon Downham, extreme weather, extreme sand, and extremely committed local journalism. Trigger warning. Just on the western edge of the forest lies Brandon, sitting on the south bank of the Little Ouse, right where Suffolk politely begins and Norfolk decides it's had quite enough. It's one of those towns that looks, at first glance, like a perfectly ordinary Breckland settlement. A bit of forest, a bit of river, a bit of please mind the rabbits. But beneath the surface lies an industrial story so extraordinary it should really come with its own heritage theme park. The story is flint, specifically gunflint, and Brandon's relationship with it runs from the Neolithic period straight through to the Battle of Waterloo, and only finally gives up in 1996, when the last practising flint knapper died and the industry quietly shuffled into the overcrowded afterlife of British trades. The flint here is the good stuff. Dense, uniform, and sharp enough to make tools, weapons, and the occasional archaeologist bleed. The chalk bedrock around Brandon produces some of the finest in the country, which is why the Neolithic miners at Grimes Graves, 5 miles northeast, were already digging for it around 2600 BC. By the medieval period, Brandon was supplying flints for building works across East Anglia, but the Napoleonic Wars are where the town really hit its industrial stride, the moment history looked at Brandon and said, "Right, you're up." At the height of the conflict in 1813, the town's knappers were producing over 1 million musket flints per month for the British Army under contract to the Board of Ordnance. A Brandon flint was considered the gold standard, good for around 50 shots, which in musket terms is the difference between reload calmly and start making peace with your God. The work was brutal. 10-hour days in workshops so poorly ventilated that 7 out of 8 workers in one shop died of silicosis, bronchitis or pneumonia. Children as young as 11 were apprenticed for 7-year terms, because nothing says character building like inhaling powdered rock for most of your adolescence. The industry began its long decline after the introduction of percussion caps in 1835. Though Brandon flints continued to be exported to Africa and were still in use as late as 1935. The last napper, Fred Avery, died in 1996, ending a trade that had outlasted the Roman Empire, the Norman Conquest, the Reformation, the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars. It didn't collapse, it simply ran out of customers. A 4,000-year-old industry defeated not by economics or technology or war, but by the modern world collectively deciding it no longer needed small razor-sharp rocks to make things explode. The Jet Set. Wongford is a tiny village in West Suffolk tucked between Brandon and Lakenheath. Its population was 7 in 2001, which is fewer people than the number of devices connected to your Wi-Fi right now. The parish appears in the Domesday Book as one Forder, with 29 households, which is practically metropolitan by today's Wongford standards. Its medieval church, St Denis, sits so close to the end of RAF Lakenheath's runway that you half expect the vicar to issue ear defenders with the order of service. Let's talk about the neighbour then. RAF Lakenheath is one of those places that technically counts as a Royal Air Force station, but in practice is about as British as a New Mexico sunrise. The base has been home to the United States Air Force since the early Cold War, and today it functions as the beating heart of American air power in Europe. A vast, self-contained slice of the USA dropped onto the Suffolk landscape like someone misclicked during a game of SimCity. It hosts the 48th Fighter Wing, the Liberty Wing, which fields thousands of personnel and 4 combat-ready squadrons, making it the largest American fighter presence on the continent. The base's Cold War heritage is still visible, not least in the recently restored F-100D Super Sabre at the gate, rededicated in 2025 after a restoration that returned it to its original 3-stripe paint scheme, as if the aircraft had just popped out for a spa day. If the Cold War gave Lakenheath its purpose, the present day has given it a schedule. By 2025, both of the base's F-35A Lightning II squadrons had reached full operational capability, giving the United States a permanent stealth jet presence in Europe at a time when deterring Russia is once again a full-time job. These aircraft have already forward deployed to Poland, trained across NATO airspace, and generally behave like the world's most expensive reminder that Suffolk is now on the front line of global geopolitics. Meanwhile, the older F-15E Strike Eagles continue to fly alongside them, though the long-term plan is to phase them out and stand up a 3rd F-35 squadron by the end of the decade. It's the sort of force structure that makes the surrounding villages feel like they're starring in a Tom Clancy adaptation set in a place that still can't get a decent mobile signal. And then there's the recent activity, the kind that makes headlines even when the Air Force would prefer it didn't. In November 2024, personnel at Lakenheath, Mildenhall and Feltwell reported multiple drone incursions, prompting scrambled jets and the deployment of counter-UAS systems, because nothing says quiet rural life like intercepting mystery drones over a field of sugar beet. In 2025, the base continued its relentless tempo of multinational exercises, readiness drills and high-profile visits, including producing a year in review that looked less like a military summary and more like a highlight reel for a very loud, very expensive action film. All of which means that RAF Lakenheath remains exactly what it has been for decades. A place where global strategy, local weather and the occasional unmanned aircraft all collide over a patch of Suffolk heathland that never asked for this level of excitement. Lakenheath village, meanwhile, sits just down the road looking like it wandered in from a completely different genre. It's all cottages, takeaways and a high street that feels designed for a world where the most dramatic event is someone parking badly outside the co-op. And yet, this is a settlement that lives in the acoustic shadow of the 48th Fighter Wing. A place where you can buy a sausage roll, step outside, and immediately be drowned out by an F-35 rehearsing for the end of days. The village has adapted with a kind of stoicism only Suffolk can muster. Conversations pause mid-sentence, pint glasses vibrate gently in pub windows, and everyone carries on as if supersonic aircraft overhead are just an unusually confident species of bird. It's the Lakenheath paradox in miniature. A perfectly ordinary English village that just happens to share a postcode with American air power. A place where global geopolitics meets a Greg's meal deal. Crouching tiger, hidden drainage. Further east, Sedge Fen and Burnt Fen aren't villages so much as concepts. Vast rectangles of reclaimed peatland lying in the triangle formed by the River Great Ouse, River Little Ouse and River Lark. They're the sorts of places where the horizon makes you wonder if the world has crashed and failed to load the rest of the scenery. Black peat, straight ditches and fields producing sugar beet and cereals across a landscape so flat it feels like the world's largest spirit level demonstration. Both areas sit at or below sea level, and only the continuous operation of drainage pumps prevents the whole arrangement from reverting to its pre-17th century personality. A soupy wilderness of sedge, reed, willow and eel. It's prime agricultural land now, but only in the same way a houseboat is prime real estate. Technically true, but entirely dependent on pumps and blind optimism. Before the drainage, this was the domain of the Fen Tigers. Not animals, but humans who had evolved to thrive in a landscape that was basically a wetland-themed escape room. They fished, caught eels, cut reeds, dug peat, and were deeply suspicious of anyone who arrived wearing dry socks. When large-scale drainage began in the 1630s, it was paid for by the merchant adventurers, a consortium of landowners and speculators convinced the Fens would be vastly improved if they owned them, and engineered by Cornelius Vermaiden. The Fen Tigers responded with a sort of community engagement rarely seen in modern planning disputes. They tore down dikes, sabotaged sluices and set reed beds on fire. It was a 17th century equivalent of a strongly worded Facebook post, except it involved arson and a much higher eel count. They lost. The drainage went ahead. The eels left. Their entire economy evaporated like a puddle in a heatwave. Burnt Fen in particular carries the history in its name. The area was levelled through paring and burning, slicing off the vegetation, drying it, torching it and spreading the ashes like some kind of agricultural Viking funeral. It later became a formally managed drainage district under the Fen Drainage Act 1758, responsible for 17,140 acres, over 40 miles of drainage ditches and 2 pumping stations lifting water up to 16 feet into the high-level rivers. It's the sort of infrastructure that works beautifully right up until the moment it doesn't, at which point the entire district remembers it used to be a lake and starts acting accordingly. Sedge Fen, meanwhile, sits near the site of Red Mere, a medieval lake that had the good sense to disappear by the 17th century, presumably after taking one look at the drainage plans and decided it wasn't sticking around for this. Today, both areas remain sparsely populated, dotted with isolated farmsteads and long straight droves, a place where the land is so flat that even the clouds look like they're following drainage regulations. Let that sink in. Prickwillow is the sort of name that makes you laugh the first time you hear it, then immediately feel childish, then laugh again because you're clearly not maturing anytime soon. It sounds like something that should come with a cream, a warning label, or perhaps both. There, see, I couldn't help myself. It's a name that defeats adulthood on contact. It sits on the River Lark, a few miles east of Ely, in a landscape so flat it feels like someone tried to iron Cambridgeshire and got carried away. The village grew up around the drainage works that made this part of the Fens habitable in the first place. A reminder that Prickwillow exists not because the land wanted people, but because the water briefly gave up. Its name actually comes from the practice of cutting prickets from willow to pin down thatch, a detail that sounds quaint until you realise it's basically medieval cable management. The ground here is so unstable that the church and school were built on piles. Timber or concrete posts driven deep into the ground so the building doesn't slowly sink into the peat like a bewildered postman who took one step too far off the path. Constructing them directly on peat would have been like building on a memory foam mattress during an earthquake. The old vicarage famously had to keep adding steps to its front door as the land sank beneath it, a sort of architectural time-lapse of the Fens slowly remembering there used to be a swamp. By the 1920s, the peat was dropping at around 2 inches a year, and while the rate has slowed, it hasn't stopped. The village actually sits on a rodham, a natural raised bank which is the Fenland equivalent of living on high ground, except the high ground here is about the height of a packet of biscuits. Prickwillow's great monument to this hydraulic struggle is the Prickwillow Museum, housed in the old pumping station on the River Lark. Inside sits the star attraction, a 1924 Merleys Bickerton and Day diesel pumping engine, weighing roughly 25 tonnes and restored to full working order. It's demonstrated on special open days by volunteers who look rightly proud to be operating machinery that once kept half of Cambridgeshire from turning back into broth. The museum also preserves earlier engines, including 6 large British-built diesel pumping engines rescued from Fenland pumping stations, all part of the long industrial lineage that kept this landscape above water through the 19th and 20th centuries. The museum setting is almost too on the nose. A picturesque building on the riverbank complete with moorings, a cafe and a car park that sits only a few metres from the machinery that prevented the entire area from reverting to amphibious real estate. It is, without quite meaning to be, a shrine to the most important infrastructure most people never think about. The pumps that stop southern England from quietly dissolving. It's hard to imagine a more British triumph. A pleasant afternoon out celebrating the machinery that prevents the region from dissolving like a digestive in a cup of tea. Cross purposes. Continuing east along the A142, Queen Adelaide is one of those names that suggests a place where monarchs once stayed, treaties were signed, and absolutely none of that ever happened. In reality, it's a 19th century hamlet that didn't exist until the railways arrived and someone built a pub for the workers. A pub named after Queen Adelaide, wife of King William IV. The settlement that grew around it simply borrowed the name, meaning there's a corner of Cambridgeshire whose entire identity can be traced back to a Victorian licensing decision. This is either a charming quirk of English history or proof that we should never let infrastructure engineers name things. Because this is how you end up with a hamlet that sounds like it should have a palace but actually has a B-road, a level crossing and the faint smell of diesel. It sits on the River Great Ouse, about 1.5 miles northeast of Ely, which is close enough that the cathedral looms over it like a benevolent but slightly judgmental neighbour. The hamlet's main street, the B1382, is sliced through by 3 separate railway lines, the Fen line, the Brecon line and the Ely-Peterborough line, each with its own level crossing, as if Network Rail decided to see how much infrastructure it could cram into a settlement the size of a bus queue. It's the only place in Britain where 3 different trains can form a tag team dedicated to ruining your day, a sort of rolling stock pincer movement. Running north from the Queen Adelaide Bridge is the Adelaide Strait, a ruler strait section of the Great Ouse completed in 1829 as part of the drainage and navigation works that were busy turning the Fens from accidental lake into accidental farmland. In 1944, when wartime restrictions made the Thames unusable, the Oxford-Cambridge boat race was held here instead, producing the surreal spectacle of one of Britain's most historic sporting events taking place in a drainage channel. It happened again in 2021, this time thanks to the closure of Hammersmith Bridge. And once more the Fens found themselves hosting elite rowers, while local anglers looked on with the expression of people who had not planned for any of this and would quite like their river back now, thanks. Queen Adelaide is, in short, a place where a pub created a hamlet, a drainage cut became a sporting venue, and 3 railway lines decided to cross the same road out of sheer spite. It's the Fens distilled. Improbable, functional and quietly hilarious. A landscape that keeps proving it can out-weird you just when you think you've got the measure of it. The Eel Deal. Ely is a city that, by any reasonable geographic logic, should not exist where it does. Before the Fens were drained in the 17th century, it was an island, the Isle of Ely, rising a heroic 39 metres above the surrounding marsh on an outcrop of Kimmeridge clay, accessible mainly by boat and otherwise defended by the kind of wetland that feels personally offended by human presence. The name means exactly what it sounds like, Island of Eels, because the surrounding water was so full of eels that they effectively became legal tender. The stone for Ely Cathedral was literally purchased from Peterborough Abbey at the rate of 8,000 eels per year, which is either a charming medieval anecdote or the worst supermarket loyalty scheme ever devised. The whole enterprise began with St Etheldreda, an Anglo-Saxon queen who founded a monastery here in 672 AD. She'd been given the Isle of Ely as a wedding gift, which is one way to demonstrate eternal devotion, assuming your beloved enjoys bog-surrounded isolation. And when her second husband challenged her vow of chastity, she retreated to the island and established what became one of the richest Benedictine communities in England. When her body was allegedly found without a trace of decay 17 years after her death, pilgrims flocked here for centuries, because nothing says holy site like a corpse that refuses to cooperate with basic biology. This is all the more impressive when you discover she reportedly succumbed to bubonic plague. Her shrine was destroyed in 1541, but a slate still marks the spot, mainly so people don't spend the afternoon hunting for a missing saint like it's some medieval Easter egg. The current cathedral was begun in 1083 by Simeon, a relative of William the Conqueror, and took over a century to complete. At 161 metres, it's one of the longest cathedrals in Britain, and for 8 centuries its towers dominated a landscape so flat that the building could be seen from miles away, earning it the nickname the Ship of the Fens. It still looks like a vessel that's accidentally beached itself on a hill and is waiting for the tide to come back. Its most astonishing feature is the octagon tower, built between 1328 and 1342 after the original Norman tower collapsed without warning one night in 1322. Probably because the ground beneath it had been quietly dissolving for centuries. A chap called Alan of Walsingham designed a replacement that had never been attempted before. An octagonal stone lantern 23 metres wide, supported by 8 massive oak beams, topped with a 400-ton wooden lantern of oak and lead. It looks from inside as though it's floating. A medieval flex so outrageous it feels like the builders briefly forgot they were meant to be afraid of gravity. Walsingham had no precedent, no engineering qualification, and was around 650 years too early for computer modelling. He had geometry, nerve, and the confidence of a man who'd never been told that's not possible. It has stood for nearly 700 years. Ely also has a proud place in the national tradition of resisting authority and then being crushed by it. Hereward the Wake, the Anglo-Saxon resistance leader, made his last stand here after the Norman conquest, using the island's natural defences before being driven out, negotiating terms, or vanishing into legend, depending on which version you prefer. The historical record is, to put it politely, flexible. What is certain is that Ely's inaccessibility made it rich. By the time of the Doomsday Survey, it was the second wealthiest abbey in England, because nothing accumulates wealth like a monastery you can't easily get to. Today, Ely is the second smallest city in England, with a population of around 20,000, and carries this distinction with the serene confidence of somewhere that's been important since the 7th century and sees no need to shout about it. It still rises above the Fens like a beacon, and remains one of the few places where you can stand in the middle of a city and still feel as though you're on an island that hasn't entirely forgiven the rest of England for draining its natural defences. And yet, even in this cathedral-topped serenity, modern life intrudes. Most recently via a local street artist who left £7,000 of graffiti damage across the city before being sentenced. A man who was not exactly Banksy, unless Banksy has recently pivoted to the aesthetic of toddler with a spray can. Taking the plunge. Witchford sits 2.5 miles west of Ely, a village that looks entirely unbothered by the fact that its history is stacked like a badly shuffled deck. Iron Age settlement, Roman activity, Anglo-Saxon burials, a World War II bomber base, and now a business park with a name that sounds like it sells mid-range office furniture. It's the sort of place where you can stand in a car park and be reasonably confident there are at least 3 centuries of human remains directly beneath your feet, quietly judging your parking. The most Wychford moment in Wychford's history came in 1942, when construction began on RAF Wychford. A bulldozer operator, attempting to create a runway, instead created an archaeological crisis by ploughing straight through an Anglo-Saxon pagan cemetery, crushing around 30 skeletons before anyone could shout "Whoa!". Major Gordon Fowler salvaged what he could, and the finds were later dated to AD 450 to 650, which means the airfield was built directly on top of early medieval graves because war, famously, does not pause for archaeology. The cemetery was recorded, the artefacts preserved, and the runways laid. 1,000 years of history, a few hours of panicked bone gathering, and then tarmac. Like Time Team if they'd been sponsored by JCB. RAF Wychford opened in June 1943 and became home to No. 115 Squadron, which remained until April 1945. Wychford's place in RAF history is both significant and sombre. 99 aircraft were dispatched from the station and never returned, and the squadron suffered the highest aircraft losses of any RAF squadron in the entire war. The memorial at the former airfield site does what British memorials do best: present the number quietly and trust you to feel the weight of it. And then there's Wychford's most improbable story. Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alkermaid, a rear gunner in 115 Squadron, shot down on 24th of March 1944. Trapped in a Lancaster that was enthusiastically on fire at 18,000 feet, parachute reduced to something between charcoal and concept, he made the sort of decision you only get to make once: jump or stay and roast. So he jumped and fell 3.5 miles, straight down, into a pine forest and a snowdrift that apparently decided to take the day off from physics because he walked away with a sprained leg. The kind of injury you normally get from stepping off a curb while thinking about lunch. It remains one of the most statistically unreasonable survival stories in aviation history. The sort of thing a film producer would reject for being too far-fetched. Forgetting that someone once greenlit Armageddon, and that's a film in which NASA decides it's easier to train oil drillers to be astronauts than astronauts to use a drill. After the war, Wychford was briefly considered as a site for Project Emily's Thor nuclear missiles, until someone realised the land belonged to the Church Commissioners, who presumably preferred not to diversify into weapons of mass destruction. The missiles went to nearby RAF Meeple instead, and the older locals still refer to that site as the Rocket Base, with the tone of people who lived next door to Armageddon and found it mildly inconvenient. Wychford itself became Lancaster Way Business Park, a light industrial estate whose name nods politely to the past while ensuring nobody thinks too hard about the Anglo-Saxon cemetery underneath. And also because former Bomber Command Airfield and accidental Anglo-Saxon burial ground retail park didn't test well with tenants. I'll get over it. Sutton, formerly Sutton in the Isle, the Isle referring to the Isle of Ely on whose western ridge it perches, has the particular personality of a fen village that knows it's on the only high ground for miles. From here, the land falls away into the kind of flatness that makes you question whether your eyesight is failing or the horizon has simply given up. The village's position on the raised isle gives it commanding views across the surrounding low-lying fens, and its church tower, a distinctive pepper-pot-shaped octagon-on-octagon structure, has long served as a navigation point for anyone trying to work out where the hell they are in this vast horizontal expanse. Sutton's most surprising 20th century footnote involves a tracked hovercraft, because why wouldn't it? In the 1960s, the hamlet of Sutton Galt became the test site for one of the world's first hover trains, an experimental air-cushioned vehicle designed by Professor Eric Laithwaite, the man whose work on linear induction motors would later underpin magnetic levitation transport. The prototype, the RTV-31, ran along a 1-mile track beside the Old Bedford River, reaching speeds of up to 100 miles per hour before the project was cancelled in 1973, as all British experimental transport projects inevitably are. Today, all that remains are a few concrete pillars sinking slowly into the fen, like the remnants of a civilization that briefly flirted with the future before deciding it preferred tractors, mud and a quiet life. Sutton also contains a smaller area called the Americas, a name that appears in the 1881 census and has never been satisfactorily explained. Most villages get a high street or a back lane. Sutton, apparently, decided to annex a hemisphere and then never mention it again. It's the sort of detail that makes you wonder whether the parish council once got drunk and accidentally discovered colonialism. Still, Sutton is nothing if not resilient. In 2002, it won the East Cambridgeshire and the Cala England and Wales Village of the Year awards, a triple crown of rural respectability that suggests the village has recovered from both the hover train and several centuries of drainage politics with admirable composure. It also hosts, within the parish, the largest monthly auction of construction and agricultural equipment in Europe, a distinction Sutton carries with the confidence of a place that knows Paris, Berlin and Rome can't compete when it comes to second-hand slurry tankers. It's international prestige, Fen style. Freudian slop. Meeple, our closing pause for stage 40, is a small fenland village on the western edge of the Isle of Ely, where the Old Bedford River and the New Bedford River, also known as the 100-foot drain, run so close together they look like someone copy-pasted a waterway and forgot to drag it to a new location. The only significant road bridges over both rivers in the Isle are found here, which gives Meeple a strategic importance wildly disproportionate to its size. The name comes from Old English for nook of land belonging to a man named Meeper, which is at least admirably literal, and the settlement appears in records from the reign of King John, meaning Meeple has been quietly existing since long before the Fens were persuaded to behave. Between Meeple and Sutton, RAF Meeple was constructed in 1942 and opened in 1943, becoming the wartime home of No. 75 New Zealand Squadron, the only squadron to occupy the site for the entire war. They flew 8,017 operations, the highest total of any squadron in RAF Bomber Command. A number so large, it feels like it should come with a footnote explaining how they found the time, the aircraft or the stamina. After the war, Meeple's quiet fields were drafted into the Cold War with the kind of bureaucratic calm only Britain can muster. In 1957, the former airfield became one of the UK's 20 Thor missile sites. Each site housed with a single PGM-17 Thor IRBM armed with a 1.44 megaton W-49 warhead, roughly 100 times the yield of Hiroshima. The missiles arrived aboard Douglas C-124 Globemaster II transports, aircraft so vast they looked like they'd been designed by someone who didn't believe in scale or proportion. RAF crews trained at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, conducting 21 live launches, which must have felt like going from beat fields to a Cold War theme park where everything is loud, classified and pointed at Russia. The moment of greatest tension came during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when 59 of the UK's 60 Thor missiles were placed on full alert. For a few days, one of the most dangerous square miles in Europe was not Berlin or Moscow, but a patch of Cambridgeshire farmland between Meeple and Sutton. Thor was always intended as a stopgap, a nuclear bridge to the true ICBM era, which explains why the whole project vanished almost as quickly as it arrived. The launch pads were dismantled, the land sold, and the Fens, as ever, absorbed the entire episode with complete indifference, as though nuclear brinkmanship were just another minor drainage issue. Meeple's most improbable brush with celebrity came courtesy of Clement Freud, grandson of Sigmund Freud, the Austrian neurologist who invented psychoanalysis, gave the world the concept of the unconscious mind, and ensured that for the rest of time absolutely everything could be interpreted as a metaphor for your parents. Clement, meanwhile, took this towering intellectual inheritance and somehow converted it into a CV that reads like a randomizer malfunctioning. Claridge's chef, dog food spokesman, greyhound owner, cookery writer, Liberal MP, and an after-dinner speaker whose timing could have been used to calibrate atomic clocks. During his parliamentary years he lived in the Cross Keys pub in Meeple, which presumably offered him both accommodation and a reliable supply of human behaviour to observe, judge and quietly weaponise in his columns. It's a career arc that suggests the unconscious really does lead you to unexpected places, sometimes Vienna, sometimes a pub in Meeple with a view of 2 parallel drainage channels. The road west carries on across the Fens, the Bedford rivers running in parallel on either side. The landscape so flat it feels like geography walked out mid-shift, and the sky is just covering until someone bothers to fix it. Home Fen lies ahead, finally, and for once, exactly where it's supposed to be on the route. The lowest point in Britain waits there, 4 metres below sea level, and after 40 weeks of heading towards it, we are, at last, about to step into the bottom of the country. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.